was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Kyle. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Michelle Rempel, Conservative MP for Calgary Nose Hill, and her party's immigration critic, who has successfully taken on the Yazidi genocide as a pivotal political issue. It is thanks to Ms. Rempel that in 2016, 313 MPs voted unanimously in favor of a conservative motion to recognize that the violence perpetrated by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant against the Yazidis constitutes genocide, and commit to providing asylum to women and girls from the persecuted minority group within 120 days. As noted in a newspaper article on the day of the vote, quote, "For months, the Liberals had skirted Rempel's increasingly loud calls for asylum, saying they were concerned about the level of danger in Iraq and the need to work with the UN Nations High Commission on Refugees, which refers refugees for resettlement. But last week, the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP were all on the same side, backing Rempel's motion. It was one of those things where it renewed my faith that Parliament can do something that resembles work," the Calgary MP said of how she brought everyone on side. But it was like pushing a boulder uphill. Here tonight to elaborate on that statement, the very honorable, in every sense of the word, Michelle Rempel. So glad you're here.
This is a topic where I just don't know where to start. So I'm really going to just try and take my hat off as a politician and speak as a human being. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of history on the Canadian response to this crisis, and give it a little bit of a face for you, and then give you a sense of the work that still needs to be done. Because the world's, for all of the institutions that we have in place, and for all of the good that we think that we do, the world was not equipped, or not willing in some cases, to respond to this crisis, which is ongoing to this day. And then close with where I think we need to go. So a bit of a call to action. So my first encounter with the Yazidi community happened in late 2015 when I was just newly appointed after the election as the Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Immigration. And just through the different people in the community, this man, Mirza Ismail from Toronto, was in my office with a group of Yazidi. And you have to keep in mind that the Yazidi community in Canada at that time was 200, 300 people in total in the country. And there are times, everybody has a moment or moments in their life when your life changes and you feel a conviction, or you know that you have a role to play in something. And that was a moment for me. This man sat down and told me of family members that were forced to eat their children because ISIS has boiled them. I cannot underscore the severity of the genocide that occurred, the number of men that were shot and pushed into mass graves. Like we're tens of thousands of people, you know, thousands and thousands of women gathered up and sold like cattle, rape being used as a tool of war. I mean, you know, when we say never again, we have to do something. We can't just say it. We have to do something. And this was clearly a situation where Canada had a role to play. What I did not expect was the inertia and the inability of our system to to respond, not just in Canada, but around the world. So Barbara went a little bit into the action that happened, but there wasn't one motion. There has been 2 motions in the House of Commons, many motions at our parliamentary committee, forced studies, and this would not have happened without the work of many people in this room who helped put political pressure on this government to do something. The first motion, the concept that Kyle put forward is so important in that we knew this genocide was happening. Like this wasn't an esoteric principle. Like the evidence was on YouTube, right? So we had a motion where there was an increasing body of evidence that genocide was occurring. We had a motion in the House of Commons to declare it a genocide so that Canada would then go into action, because it's, genocide isn't about standing and apologizing for a genocide. Genocide is about preventing a genocide and stopping it when it's occurring, right? We have to, so there was so much action that was happening, and I just couldn't believe that our institutions couldn't respond quickly enough. But when it came to refugee resettlement, there was a major initiative after the 2015 campaign election to bring refugees from the Syrian and Iraqi areas to Canada. And there was, approximately 25,000, 30,000 people brought to Canada. But the number of people that came to Canada through that refugee resettlement process that were from this cohort of people were zero. Not one. So just to, first of all, to find out how many people had been referred for resettlement. And for those of you who don't know, very briefly, there are 2 ways that you can, simplifying it, 2 ways that you can be referred to Canada as a refugee. One is through a program called the Government-Sponsored Refugee Program, and that's where the United Nations gives Canada a list of people to resettle. And these are people who have made it to a UN refugee camp and have gone through the selection process. And then the government essentially sponsors people to come over. There's another program many of you in this room have worked very hard to support, privately sponsored refugee programs. But again, there's still a selection process and there's a big delay. And when we asked, my former colleague Chris Alexander famously asked for an analysis after the Sinjar massacre happened in 2014, had asked how many persecuted minority groups how many persons had been referred by the United Nations after the genocide had started. That audit became public during the campaign, and it was accusations of racism, right? But the reality is that when a genocide is ongoing and people are being persecuted because of their ethnicity or their religion, and that makes them vulnerable, we actually need to reflect that in our refugee resettlement processes. And this was the big hurdle this was one of the big hurdles that we encountered in trying to get people to come to Canada. Now, for me, this whole conversation around the Yazidi genocide has raised some very uncomfortable and difficult issues for Canadians to talk about. We have to talk about the fact that what is a refugee? What constitutes a refugee? There's varying schools of thought on that today. Who should be prioritized in our refugee resettlement programs? These are tough concepts that governments don't want to touch, right? It's easier just to say we're only going to rely on the United Nations. But if the United Nations is not referring these people to come to Canada, what we have to do, we have to fix or reform the system, and that was a big task. So the initial response that we got when we approached the government on trying to get these women resettled to Canada, the Germans had started to do a small program to bring some of the women that were being rescued to provide because you can imagine that these women had very specialized needs, right, in terms of trauma support, gynecological support, medical support. They needed support that was just not available in the region. So the Germans started to do this, and we started to push to say, look, we need to do the same thing here in Canada. The response that we got was, we can't do that because the United Nations selects us, and we will not prioritize minorities. So there's a need for us to be equitable, but there's also a need for us to use common sense in a situation like this. So we, I could speak for hours, but we had to do a full committee study where some of the survivors of this community, including Nadia Murad, came to Canada to testify to what had happened. They talked about the discriminations that they faced in UN camps, the fact that they went to these camps. Those who are lucky enough to be able to get to the camps were then severely tortured by the ethnic majority and religious majority in these camps, so they couldn't get to the camp to get into the process. That the UN agents had given people appointment dates for the resettlement process 6-7 years in the future, where other people, can you imagine that? Like, where some people were getting, appointments the next week. There was very clear discrimination. And when we had the United Nations set, it was sitting in front of our committee. It was almost like they were offended, right? It was like, well, how dare you say anything about this? It's like, well, we can talk about the United Nations as an organization, but there's a wrong here that needs to be righted. And I had a senior representative from the UNHCR in my office around the same time, and I said, look, how come you haven't referred any genocide survivors as part of the Syrian refugee and Iraqi refugee initiative? And they said, well, we were under a time crunch, and it was easier just to do what we did. And so there's a question about doing what's easy and doing what's right. So through this study that happened we forced an emergency summer session of our parliamentary committee through intense political pressure. And for those of you in the room who helped with that, thank you. Coming out of that, at the same time, was a report in June of 2016 where the United Nations actually said, hey, this is a genocide. There are recommendations in that report. We forced a second motion, which, as Barbara mentioned, did pass, but it only passed, and I'll be very honest, because there are people sitting in this room and across this country that sat on the phone every day calling Liberal members of Parliament saying, you have to do the right thing. And it took Nadia Murad, so all the credit goes to her. She had survived some pretty serious stuff. I like to refer to her now as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, not as a sex slave survivor. She sat in the gallery in the House of Commons and watched. And I'm not sure how the vote would have gone without her courage there. So then after that, it was months of poking the government to actually follow, because the motion's not binding on the House of Commons. The media getting up, columns being written saying we have to change the process because the United Nations still didn't have the capacity to refer these people to Canada. So we had to force the government to set up a special program. And in the end of that, they only brought 1,200 people, and not all of them were Yezidis. We would have liked to have seen a lot more, but hey, it's a start. From that, Canada has not been well equipped to support these women and these survivors when they've come to Canada. Very briefly, these are some of the needs that need to happen. First of all, the instance of justice. We are not equipped to give these women justice in Canada right now. We have to talk about the fact that it's not just about removing these women from harm's way and frankly, I could speak at length about the fact that by removing people from their Indigenous homelands, we are actually completing the genocide, right? If the international community is not securing that space, we are actually completing that genocide, but I'll park that. We have to deal with the question of returned ISIS terrorists in Canada. We cannot allow them to carry on like nothing has happened because they are complicit in genocide. This isn't about one big bad guy. This is, as Nadia Murad says, this is about anybody who pushed propaganda, who traveled there and turned a blind eye. Everyone knew what was happening here. They were all complicit in this, and Canada can't just allow this to happen. So I've had motions in the House of Commons recently, press conferences where we're trying to force the government to take specific action with regard to pursuing the Yezidi genocide case through international organizations like the International Criminal Court. But given the complexities around that system, the least we can do is deal with this at home. There's the question of justice. Then there's the question of the fact that many of these women speak a very, and the men that come, any Yazidi, they speak a very rare dialect called Kurmanji. And when I'm looking, I think there was only 2 Kurmanji interpreters in all of Canada when they started to come. So I had a family who was resettled in Calgary, who, a family of women, all of them had survived sexual slavery. They were in a house in the middle of a Calgary winter by themselves, and the person that they sent over to help interpret and take them grocery shopping was an Arabic speaking Sunni Muslim man. Very nice man, but not the right person to send to us, right? And so it just showed, like, being able to get these women into, we forced another committee study on the resettlement services, access to support and trauma care, just getting them housing, education, all of these things where there wasn't an existing diaspora community has just been an uphill battle day after day, and that struggle is still ongoing. In fact, last week I moved another motion in the House of Commons to try and concur in a report. It's a parliamentary procedure that forces a House vote on certain recommendations. I'll be doing that again this week. The last part that I'll close with, so that you know, is that we still don't have any movement on the refugee resettlement process itself. So one of the greatest things that these women need, and I say women because so many of the men were killed in the genocide, it has mostly been women that have come to Canada. One of the biggest things that they need to resettle and integrate into Canada is to be reunited with their families. So how the government-sponsored refugee program works is that if you're selected to become resettled to Canada, you have to essentially fill out a list of your surviving immediate family members, and that they use that list, I'm oversimplifying, but to potentially reunite people to Canada within something called the 1-year window. Now the problem is if you have just been freed from sexual slavery, you're now being resettled to Canada, you don't know if your extended family is alive or dead. So many of these women thought that their family members were dead and didn't put them on that list. We're finding out that they're alive, and the government is saying, sorry, we can't sponsor you. So I'm trying to change that process for this cohort. The other thing is there's a great injustice that happens. If you presently are in upstate New York and decide to enter Canada at an unofficial point of entry tonight, so you decided to do that and claimed asylum, you would have a protected person status for all intents and purposes in Canada. But the next day, any of your extended family, tomorrow morning, as soon as your application has been processed, could cross the border at a legal point of entry and have that same status. And that the definition for extended family under that particular system is aunts, uncles, cousins. It's a very broad definition. For the Yazidi survivors, it's immediate family, like children and spouse, and that is it. So we are applying a completely different set of standards to people who have already reached the safety of upstate New York, as opposed to somebody who is going through an ongoing genocide. And for those of you who are involved in the privately sponsored refugee program, there's a 65,000 case backlog, with many of these people having to be forced to wait for 6, 7, 8 years in some instances to have any hope of coming to Canada. It's so bad that when I go and meet with these women in Winnipeg, the last time I was in Winnipeg, I'm going back on Friday, one of the women told me that she wants to go back. Because so I would just like to say, you know, in politics, you know, one of the things I've learned is that politicians and legislators, sometimes we don't ask a very basic question: what are we managing to? And then, you know, as a cabinet minister, I'm a former cabinet minister, your job, once you understand what you're managing to, is to move your public servants into that direction, to set up programs, structure things to a specific outcome. What you don't want to have happen is your public servants, many of whom are wonderful people, tell you that things can't change because we've always done it this way. And in this instance, regardless of political stripe, Canada, I do feel, and some of our global institutions, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, it's very clear that our processes for dealing with the resettlement and support of the atrocity crimes and bringing people to justice are no longer functional. And we have to ask for reform in order to manage to something that brings justice to people, that actually prevents and stops genocide and ensures that it doesn't happen again. So that would be my call to action for you. To me, this is not, I don't understand why there's any element of partisan politics in this. Like this is, Canada is the country of welcoming people who are in the worst possible situations. It doesn't matter where you come from or what your background. That is Canada's situation. But we do have to have a hard conversation about how we're prioritizing people, how we're helping them once they get here, how we budget for that. We can't resettle the world. That is not, you know, as Kyle told me earlier today, it's only one part. It's probably the least durable of the durable solutions is resettlement. So how do we in the small part that we do, how do we select people? And we can't shy away from having that conversation. How do we support people when we're here? And then we need to stand together and change. And so I guess my call is very simple. And it sounds so basic and so far removed from where we need to be, but it's where we're at. And it's we can't let the status quo and inertia and just this propensity to say, well, we've always done it this way, or this is too tough a conversation to have, to allow us to stop or prevent a genocide, or to help some of the most vulnerable people in the world. If we can't just get past that point, we're never going to do this. So that's what I just ask you, regardless of, you know, how you vote or what your political flavor is. In Canada, on this issue, we can't let the status quo maintain. We have to push for change. And then we also need to come forward with positive policy proposals that are going to support these people over time. Many of the people in this room have been instrumental in developing and some very future thinking. I literally could, I'm sorry for taking so long, Barbara, but I just want to express some passion. There's so many positive policy proposals that could make Canada more nimble, a world leader in this area. And I just, if you want to read that, ask any of the people who are speaking here tonight. We're happy to enlighten you on that. But this is really where the rubber hits the road. It's we either get this right or we fail. And, you know, for me, I don't want to have to stand up in the House of Commons, or my successor or my successor's successor, years and decades in the front, having to issue an apology to the Yazidi people because we didn't get it right. We have the opportunity now, so let's do it. Thanks.
Michelle, that was wonderful. Your passion, I think you really convey the deep passion you have for this topic, and I think it's inspirational for all of us to hear it, as tough as it is to hear some of the details about what's happening. We've all felt that something was very wrong with the government response. You became the kind of lightning rod for it. You've articulated it well, the problems and what needs to happen.